This video is brought to you by HelloFresh. Get tasty, easy to cook meals sent right to your door, but more on that later.
Video games! I love them. I've been something of a gamer for most of my life. From The Legend of Zelda, to Final Fantasy, to Resident Evil, I've played a boatload of games across a myriad of categories. But one category I've mostly stayed away from is that of the games based on anime, because for the most part, it's pretty widely accepted that anime video games aren't of the highest quality. Just like with anything, these fall along a spectrum, because there are games that I consider to be pretty damn good, like the Dragon Ball Z Budokai games or the Naruto Ultimate Ninja Storm games. Then you have games that are just kind of mediocre, like Afro Samurai or that 2D Inuyasha fighting game on the PS1, and then you have games that are just downright bad, like Vampire Hunter D or Jump Force. So over the years, I've done a pretty good job of both staying away from anime games and keeping my expectations low in the event something fell out of the sky. But when I started streaming on Twitch, I remember that Yu Hakusho had a game that I played when I was a kid. I remember struggling to beat it, but I couldn't quite remember if it was just because the game was that difficult or if I was just a terrible player. That piqued my curiosity for some strange reason, and it led to me wondering if there were any other Yu Hakusho games that were released in the West. This took me down a very brief rabbit hole where I played each of the games you'll be seeing today over on my Twitch, which you should check out over at twitch.tv/somewherepastnever. I'm going to take you through each of the 3 games I played and discuss their presentation, their mechanics, and their overall varying degrees of polish. Let me also add that I am aware that there are several other Yu Hakusho games out there, but they don't have localized versions or fan translations from what I can tell, and I wasn't about to struggle through a set of games that I couldn't read just for this video. But you know what you don't have to struggle through? The recipes of today's sponsor, HelloFresh. If you're anything like me, you know that it's tough to consistently eat healthy meals when it feels like there aren't enough hours in the day. Not to mention how expensive it can be to buy healthy food in the first place. But with HelloFresh, eating well in 2023 can be time efficient, stress-free, and also pretty dang tasty. With over 35 weekly recipes, they have the options you need to achieve whatever dietary goals you may have in mind. You'll get fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your front door, or if you're like me and prefer to avoid nosy neighbors, the side door. HelloFresh's latest line of meals feature robust flavors and filling portions like one of my new favorites, the sesame sweet soy fried rice. I'm no wizard in the kitchen, but the easy to follow recipe card is perfect for a complete novice like me. Can you tell I rarely, if ever, cut up produce? It's honestly pretty satisfying watching a meal come together, and the end product, aside from looking great, got a thumbs up from Mama Saturn, whose house I drove over to for this, so thanks Mom. To enjoy some tasty recipes, just click the link below for a limited time discount on your box along with free shipping and try HelloFresh today. That's definitely not a conversation I'm having on stream, I will say that. I like fisting, but not when it's happening to me. You guys know there's a chance that this is gonna show up in the video I'm working on, right? The first game we're going to cover today is the Game Boy Advance title Yu Hakusho Spirit Detective, which follows Yusuke's adventure from the point of his death at the beginning of the series up through the conclusion of the Rescue Yukina arc. Let's go ahead and start with the presentation because, yeah, the game doesn't exactly look good. The start menu is about as good as it gets in terms of the static images. This compressed image of Yusuke is probably the best sprite in the game, and that's exclusively because it has the size to allow for more detail. One thing this game does is deliver all of its exposition through text boxes with a static background of Yusuke's neighborhood, but as you can tell, the quality of the background they chose is matched only by the sheer jankiness of the franchise logo in the corner. When characters are having their back and forth, their portraits are contained in a box that doesn't exactly leave a lot of room for these sprites to avoid looking like a melted SpongeBob ice cream bar. One thing this game does have going for it that I noticed was the dialogue itself. A great deal of it is plucked word for word from the Funimation dub, which added a very thin layer of authenticity to the experience. It's not long before we get into the game itself, and this is what we're met with. So, to be fair, outside of the Game Boy Color era, I didn't do a ton of handheld gaming. I was used to the varying degrees of graphical fidelity of consoles, so I immediately forgot that this game was meant to be played on a tiny screen, of which it probably looked pretty okay. The sprites are just large enough to be able to easily identify who and where you are, as well as what attacks you're doing. It's not stylish in any way and looks rather clunky, but for what it was when it came out, it gets the job done. Although Kuwabara's sprite looks like it was plucked out of a Simpsons game, and that had me cracking up. So there's already a lot going on here, but I'm sure intuitively you can identify the aspects of the UI. You've got the 3 bars here representing Yusuke's HP, spirit energy, and experience. Over here you've got the portrait of the character you're playing as, that character's current level, and a compass to guide you toward your current objective.
The game operates from this top-down isometric angle that allows you to see a decent bit of your surroundings, or at least it would if it didn't feel like the camera was breathing down our necks. There's no map at all, so you essentially have to rely on the compass to get where you're going, although that isn't as straightforward as you might think. In the same vein as the static background for exposition, if dialogue needs to be doled out in the middle of a mission, Yusuke will just freeze in place on screen until the conversation concludes. It's kind of awkward and could have easily been mitigated with the kind of approach you see in visual novels or even games like the Persona series. The Game Boy Advance was pretty solid for its size, so I doubt that would have been too terrible to implement. There's not much in the way of menus for the player to navigate, and the extra screens that do exist are pretty bare bones. The only other screen you'll see aside from the gameplay is a stat screen, which only serves to remind you how to do each of the special moves you've unlocked. The stats literally do not matter in this game. The overworld itself can vary between actually looking kind of interesting to being the same string of buildings over and over and over. Navigation tends to suffer from the lack of a map since all you have to go on is the compass, but while the compass points you in the direction of your goal, it doesn't necessarily guide you toward a clear path to your goal. It's fairly easy to end up in a dead end where you can see your objective but have to run all the way back around. Because the compass exists, the world itself doesn't need to make sense, be easily traversable, or have landmarks that allow you to get a general sense of where you are at any time. It's like an older iteration of the problem in Fallout 3, where the developers intend for you to rely entirely on the compass. I will say that once you get into the actual adventure and away from the city, the enemy variety increases dramatically. It's not always inspired in terms of design, but I appreciate just how many different creature types there were, even though in the end there was basically no difference in how you dealt with them mechanically. Speaking of which, let's switch to how this game plays and the many mechanics therein. At its core, Spirit Detective is a beat 'em up for better or worse, that's up to you to decide. Your movement is based on an 8-direction system, so thankfully there's a bit of fluidity to that. Mechanically, you've got 3 functions: attack, interact, and character swap. When it comes to attacking, you can just throw hands with the A button or whip out one of your character's techniques that's assigned to a button combination. For Yusuke, you're most likely to be using the Spirit Gun or Shotgun. Kuwabara has the Spirit Sword, a Spirit Kick for some reason, and his Extended Sword. Kurama gets 2 different whip attacks, and Hiei can teleport and perform a Teleslash. I'm sure Hiei and Kurama gain a 3rd ability, but by the time I reached the game's conclusion, there just wasn't enough gameplay left to bring them up to speed, and I wasn't about to grind out levels. Not that I even could, since this game has no chapter or level select. Which does take us into the quirks of the gameplay. There isn't much nuance in the moment-to-moment gameplay, so aside from a tiny handful of difficulty spikes, this game is a cakewalk. I discovered very early on that if you just spam the attack button, you can almost always stunlock most non-boss enemies. You can stunlock entire groups of enemies, and they might get the occasional hit off on you. Even though you're given a full party to take on the Maze Castle section of the game, you spend the entire first half with just Yusuke and Kuwabara, so you end up prioritizing their growth over Kurama and Hiei's. If I remember correctly, during the Rescue Yukina portion, they're once again removed from your party, which only further increases the gap in power. Like I mentioned before, there isn't an option to revisit chapters so that you can grind out experience. Once a chapter is done and you've saved your game, that's it. But if you don't know that, you don't really have the tools you need to make sure that everyone is on the same level. Not that that matters, because as I said, this game is piss easy, aside from the Toguro fight at the end and certain stages when enemies are just swarming you. The character swap system is pretty easily manageable and doesn't stop the flow of gameplay. To switch between your other party members, all you need to do is press the left shoulder button. However, you can't swap characters unless the one you're swapping away from has full spirit energy. That might be inconvenient if it weren't for the fact that A, spirit energy regenerates on its own at a pretty healthy pace, and B, you can rather reliably find health and energy restoratives scattered around stages. You can even find them inside boss arenas. What's crazier than that is that in boss arenas, they replenish after like 10-15 seconds. So there's no need to play well or understand the enemy when all you have to do is run into the corners of the room and get back to full health. It takes boss encounters that are already easy and makes them even less memorable. Especially once you realize that in combination with endless restoratives, the only character you really need to play as is Yusuke, since he has access to the shotgun, which very quickly becomes a necessary attack for enemies that are either very quick, won't sit still, or both. It also appears to be the only technique in the game with any sense of crowd control. The Spirit Gun is pretty good early game when you don't have a ton of enemies to be concerned about, and it's good for nuking down early game bosses. However, a problem you'll run into is that you need to be on the exact same axis as the enemy for the Spirit Gun to connect. When I was fighting Goki, I was very slightly misaligned but assumed I'd still hit, and was surprised when my blast soared right past him. When you're in a situation where you don't have a ton of time to line up a shot perfectly, this trait can really make the spirit gun more trouble than it's worth. It's far easier to just spam the shotgun and hope for the best. Aside from the things you personally control, there are a few things you can't, which typically come in the form of gimmicks or forced gameplay. Starting with gimmicks, there are a handful of times where you're given a time limit to complete your objective. This is denoted by a stopwatch that appears just above the compass on screen. I'm not exactly sure how much time is supposed to be allotted to the player, but in a game where there's no map so all you can do is run around hoping to collide with your objective, being timed doesn't feel great. In one case, you're playing as Keiko through the scene where she rushes into Yusuke's house while it's on fire. No, I'm no math magician, nor am I an architect, but this apartment has way too many rooms to be Yusuke's home. Several of the rooms look exactly the same, there's a timer, and the compass is taken away from you. It's an instance where you have no choice but to explore every single room. And each room has fire in it that blocks the doorways, and you have to flip a switch to dispel the fire. Normally I wouldn't care at all, but you have to engage with this aspect each time you pass through a room. It always resets. Further into the story, when you're meeting Genkai for the first time, the game legitimately makes you play through the minigames she presents in the anime. You have to play a weird rock paper scissors game, you have to play a rhythm game, and you have to do one of those test your might type things where you repeatedly spam the button to fill a meter. And you have to accumulate a certain score across all 3 games in order to proceed, which can be tricky at times since making mistakes in any game takes points away. It was more tedious than anything since up till that point you're just going around busting heads. Then you have certain boss fights that lock you to one character, so God help you if you weren't at least trying to evenly level your party. This is primarily a problem in Mei's Castle when Kurama and Hiei are much weaker than Yusuke and Kuwabara. It can leave you struggling with those characters since your damage output just won't be on par with the others and may force you to grind. Speaking of grinding, it's a bit more of a chore, but not because it's annoying or difficult, but because it's so tedious and easy. The only weird thing about leveling up are the orbs themselves. You see, when an enemy dies, they drop what looks like a walnut. This is an experience orb. Cool. Fine. The problem comes in when you're swarmed with enemies and can't get to the experience you just earned. I don't know whose idea it was, but your experience orbs can and will despawn after 5 seconds or so. It's absurd. And rushing over to pick it up isn't always the best idea because that stunlock quirk I mentioned earlier can go both ways. The only genuine instance in this game that I felt like I died is during the Toguro fight at the end. The spike in difficulty is insane, and without the ability to backtrack, you can do one of 3 things. Start over and spend more time leveling up, succumb to the softlock and start over, spending more time leveling up, or you can run around the arena as Yusuke, exploiting the rate at which the restoratives spawn and continuously spam the shotgun. If Yusuke goes down in the fight, you're basically screwed since Kuwabara's range requires you to be mostly within Toguro's striking range where he hits very fast and like a truck. Toguro can easily stunlock you if you get too close and just melt your HP. There is a post game, but there's only 2 things to do. You fight a handful of major bosses again as Team Urameshi, and then you go through a boss rush as Genkai. Also, the ending of the game is pretty funny because it just abruptly cuts to a mission complete screen. After Genkai's post-game fight, you get an abrupt "the end" screen before you're unceremoniously launched back to the main menu. Overall, I enjoyed the game for what it was, but I think that's because I had a good time poking fun at it, and not necessarily because the game itself was good to me. It was an easy game full of fodder that I just kind of mindlessly punched my way through. Hell, I cleared this game, including all of the post-game content, in just over 4 hours. I'm gonna give this one 5 out of 10 Kaitos. It exists, I guess. The difficulty was non-existent, but the same can certainly not be said for our next game. What was that? The Dark Tournament came out in 2004 for the PlayStation 2 and is decidedly the most straightforward game in this video in terms of concept. Design-wise though, it's without a doubt the most frustrating and difficult. So 4th grade Saturn has been retroactively vindicated in that regard. Let's start with the presentation before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this game. Naturally, since it was designed for a home console and not a handheld, it's the most polished of the bunch. The combat sprites have a cel-shaded look to them that is accented by a heavy black outline that helps them retain that anime feeling. It helps to offset a little bit of the dead-eyed look the sprites can have from time to time. Something this game really has going for it is the occasional clip from the anime, often preceded by the same animation for episode titles. It's pretty slick, especially if you aren't expecting it. This feature makes every section feel like you're playing through an episode, though the gimmick does wear thin once the frustration starts to creep in. Voice clips from the show are also present during the gameplay in the form of characters calling out their signature attacks or having random dialogue like Hiei talking shit during Kuwabara's turn in the first real fight of the game. Once you get to the tournament proper, Kota's voice lines ripped straight from the anime act as background commentary during combat. It's a very nice touch, but does get old very quickly. The sprites have a decent bit of fluidity to them, so there isn't a ton of jank to the movement. It's not as smooth as the Budokai games, but it's not as stiff as something like Street Fighter the movie, the game. A small visual quirk that was pointed out to me during the stream was that the big monitor in the background shows the fight, but it also shows the UI. I'm not sure how I missed that, but I'm glad I know it now. The loading screens have about as much flair as an early 2000s Cartoon Network webpage. They're mostly static with the exception of the flashing loading text. The UI consists of you and your opponent's HP, a relatively bland meter for spirit energy, a timer that literally never matters since fights won't last that long, character names, and portraits of the fighters that react to taking damage. The sound design for the game is okay, I guess. It's just punchy enough to feel appropriate during combat, but still leaves something to be desired at times. Moving on to the mechanics, this is where the Dark Tournament completely shits the bed for me. Balance is the name of the game when it comes to fine-tuning a fighting game, and that's something that's sorely lacking here, but we'll get into that in a bit. As far as fighters go, the game has the basic traits you're used to if you play a lot of fighting games. You move forward and back with right and left, up and down allow you to strafe, which brings up a big problem we'll get into later, a light attack, a heavy attack, a kick, and a block button. To jump, you have to press the block button and up, plus the direction you want to go in. You're confined to an arena that often has hard edges, meaning that it's possible to force your opponent out of the designated area for a ring-out victory similar to Virtua Fighter or Bloody Roar. But this isn't always the case. Sometimes, despite the fact that you'll still be permitted to be forced out of the ring, there will be fights in which the CPU is completely protected from this method of victory by an invisible wall. Your spirit energy replenishes on its own, but never quite fast enough to be useful outside of your signature moves, most of which deplete the bar damn near in its entirety. You can hold your attack button to launch a series of rapid punches or kicks, but this also expends spirit energy, and it's incredibly easy to accidentally use the rapid attacks without meaning to. Getting into the game itself, right out the gate you're forced into a tutorial that's designed to teach you Yusuke's combos and how to pull them off, but it feels like even when you execute the prompt flawlessly, you'll still be told you've done it wrong. I struggled to pull off this one combo for ages, and then, even when I knew I hadn't done it correctly, the game just waved me through. This tutorial is unskippable and pretty worthless since, aside from very basic things like the spirit gun, you will not be able to execute the longer combo strings in an actual match for various reasons. The game gives you a move list anyway, so there isn't much reason to hold you hostage in the tutorial. On top of that, you're only given a combat tutorial for Yusuke, but not the other members of Team Urameshi who have different combat quirks and combos. So in the end, you have to turn to the move list anyway. On its own, this isn't so bad, but once you stack that with every other problem this game has, you'll start to see why this is pretty lame. The biggest problem this game has is that you, as the player, feel remarkably sluggish. Not exactly ideal in a genre of gaming that relies explicitly on the moment-to-moment gameplay. In the very best fighting games out there, every moment is a battle of wills and wit. Some of the most intense and memorable matches between friends and even in the competitive scene come down to split-second decisions or reactions, so these games need to be fine-tuned to allow for such nuanced gameplay. In the Dark Tournament, all of your animations have a wind-up and a recovery, and since there are no tools in place to cancel your input into another input, you're a sitting duck. Once you've committed to whatever nonsense you tried to pull off, you'd better hope it's exactly what you wanted because you will be punished for it in most instances. For those who may not know, a wind-up refers to the frames of an animation that lead into the execution. For a punch, it's the period in which your character is drawing their fist back to throw it out. During this period, your fist has no hitbox, so it does no damage. However, it seems like in this game, the hitbox doesn't activate until your fighter's arm is almost completely extended, which is very bad. A recovery refers to the frames of an animation after your attack has been executed and you're returning to a neutral position. Continuing to use the punch as an example, it's the period in which your fist is pulling back after the attack and the hitbox has deactivated again. In most fighting games, or at least the ones that are good, during your recovery there are usually ways to shorten this period and get back into the action. But in the Dark Tournament, you're basically locked in place during the recovery animation. You can't even chain into a block, which is also very bad. Everything you do seems to have an infuriatingly long wind-up and recovery. Want to go for a grab? That's going to cost you some time. Want to throw a punch? That's going to cost you too. Want to get up off the floor after crouching? Good luck with that, loser! The timing between crouching and standing back up is long enough that if you do anything before the animation ends, your character will cancel the animation to stand and go into another low attack. So you end up having to wait extra long, usually allowing the opponent to get several free hits on you before you can genuinely engage with the fight again. To stack on the sluggishness of your character, the enemy CPU doesn't appear to have this limitation. The CPU's attacks have blindingly short windups and basically zero recovery frames. This gives the enemy AI the ability to spam attacks much faster than you're ever able to. The windup for your animations almost always act as a punish window for the CPU. It feels like you're having your inputs read, and that dramatically narrows your avenues for victory. There was a point where every time I went to throw a punch, the enemy would do the same, and even though my animation was nearly complete, their attack would come out fast enough to completely interrupt me. If I'm blocking, the CPU kind of backs down and goes brain dead, but the moment I let go of the block button, the enemy goes right back to attacking. On top of that, the NPC is a master of perfectly timed blocks, which is likely a direct result of the input reading. In most battles, you have to go for dumb jump attacks just to create windows for ground combos. This includes all of your spirit attacks. There's no chip damage in this game, so unless you somehow manage to chain a spirit attack into a standard combo, it will be blocked 99% of the time. This makes using anything aside from Kuwabara's Spirit Sword a huge gamble and honestly just a waste of time. You'll very quickly discover that blocking is far less effective for you than it is for the CPU. Yet another quirk of this game that makes it pretty frustrating is how utterly useless strafing is, because when an enemy jumps into the air for an attack, the orientation of that attack tracks you. This is not standard in most fighting games. Once you commit to an attack in a specific direction, that's it. It's risk versus reward because a skilled player could react accordingly and punish that jumping attack. However, in this game, when you strafe around a jumping attack, the enemy just locks onto your positioning and stays in sync with you. You'll take tons of damage trying to dodge because it's just how you expect to be able to handle a jumping attack in a game that allows strafing. The problem is exacerbated by how jank the hitboxes can be. Sometimes, even if you're blocking, when taking a jumping attack, the enemy's hitbox will clip through yours and you'll take damage because it's registering you as being hit from behind. Going hand in hand with all of that, the developers really seem to love the idea of gimmick fights because they're everywhere in this game. They range in quality, entertainment, and certainly difficulty. A handful even left me scratching my head as to why they were even necessary. Here's just a few of the fights the game forces you into. In the fight against Roto, a shadow creature is also going around the arena doing damage to you. There's nothing you can do to stop this creature except kill Roto. The knife edge deathmatch comes down to you pressing the right buttons to counter Chew, but there's no obvious tell to what attack is about to come out since the attacks come out super fast, so all you can do is press buttons and hope for the best. After Hiei uses Dragon of the Darkness Flame, you're forced to fight Kuwabara without the use of your arms. After beating M's 1 through 3, you're forced to fight the transformed version of Ichigaki who hits like an absolute truck and can spam a ranged attack to zone you. You start the Kuwabara vs Risho fight at 25% HP and have to wait for an image of Yukina to pop up to fully restore your HP. In the meantime, Risho has a fast earthquake attack with infinite range that can one-shot you right out the gate if you're not quick enough to jump over it. You're forced to fight Toguro as Genkai. You're just there to get your ass kicked and die. In the Kuro Momotaro fight, Hiei's sword does no damage. In the fight against Suzuka, you have to use Spirit Reflection Blast to take him out or his spirit attacks will melt your HP away. In the fight against Karasu, you have to transform into Yoko because if you don't, any damage you deal to Karasu will also be dealt to Karama. And in the Elder Toguro fight, you only do damage if you manage to hit the designated spot on his body, and it is as awful as it sounds. For story reasons, I understand some of these gimmicks. Like when you fight Zero at the beginning, using Dragon of the Darkness Flame will instantly kill him just like it does in the anime. But then you have something like the brief section where Genkai passes the Spirit Wave Orb to Yusuke, and the game forces you to repeatedly tap the block button to restore health while Genkai fires endless spirit guns at you. The gimmick is to just survive until time runs out, and it's so stupid. I don't know if any game devs or aspiring game devs are ever going to see this video, but don't do things like this if your systems and mechanics aren't pristine. When the controls are as clunky, unintuitive, and unresponsive as they are here, these fights serve more as a headache than a refreshing change of pace. Not to mention, if you're going to have gimmick fights, at the very least be consistent about it. You one-shot Zero with the dragon, but then the game forces you to have a normal match with Makintaro, another character Hiei kills right away. In the same vein as character battles, you don't go through every single match. The game skips Bakken, Yori Urishima, and Old Man Onji, yet you have to fight M1 and M2, a transformed Ichigaki, someone Yusuke bodies immediately, and even Roto. The selection makes no sense, and that sentiment fits right at home with the overall design of this game. There is a chest-like minigame that you collect character tokens for over the course of the game, but honestly I didn't even bother with it. In full transparency, I never finished the game. The Toguro fight at the end is one of the biggest obstacles I think I've ever faced in a fighting game's campaign. Toguro is fast, has a ton of HP, has insane zoning at both close and long range, and hits even harder than transformed Ichigaki. If you get caught in one of his combos, that attempt is basically dead. Oh, and he's also one of the enemies you can't force out of the ring. Think of all the issues I talked about over the course of this section and distill them down into this one fight. To add to that dumpster fire, this is also a gimmick fight. Instead of splitting into multiple fights, there are two phases with Toguro. The moment you deplete his initial health bar, he immediately restores it and powers up. You, on the other hand, are stuck with the amount of HP you had when you initiated phase 2. Naturally, Toguro hits even harder in this phase, so if you're unprepared and get caught off guard for even a second, all of your progress in this fight will just vanish. Then it's back to phase 1 with the hopes you'll get back to the second half with enough HP to finish things off. Thankfully, from what I've seen, there is no true 100% form, which is also kind of weird considering how many nods to the story there were leading up to this final fight. But at this point, most players will be too frustrated to even care. I played the Dark Tournament for one stream and never went back to complete it for this video. That's how awful it feels to play this game. I'm gonna give this game 9 out of 10 sensuis. It definitely made me want to throw my computer out the window. Sorry, Jin. This is a perfect setup. Tournament Tactics came out on the Game Boy Advance in 2004 and were once again placed in the Dark Tournament arc. Of the games I've played, this one is without a doubt my favorite and the most enjoyable. I will say, because of the nature of this game as well as something we'll get into later, Tournament Tactics also demands the most time for completion. But hopping right in with the presentation, the game is fine. It's more clearly defined in terms of its art than Spirit Detective was, so the portraits are slightly more detailed and the sprites are charming despite their short and stumpy appearance. The overworld map is your standard static background with different nodes containing smaller areas that need to be completed before you can progress further into the island. The story is relayed through conversations with character portraits that can be anywhere from refreshingly short to strangely lengthy. Unlike Spirit Detective or Dark Tournament, which either ripped dialogue straight from the anime or play bite-sized clips of the anime to get the point across, Tournament Tactics seems to use entirely original dialogue. This allowed the story to contort the way it needed to so that the developers could pad out the lifespan, but also leads to weird situations like Kie being far more talkative than he's ever been. It's a bizarre trait that we all just poked fun at and moved along. The UI during combat is pretty simple. You've got your character's portrait and name, their level, their HP and spirit energy, their overdrive gauge, and an action menu showing you what all your potential options in combat are. There's nothing complex or overwhelming about the UI, so the game is fairly simple to pick up and just play. The mechanics of the game might seem like a lot at first, but once you've hit your stride, it's just like any other tactics-based game, more or less. Before each battle, you're taken to a party selection screen where you have a few options. At the top of the screen, you have the 5 slots that make up the party you can take into each fight. The order in which you select them does have an effect on their turn order, so be aware of that when deciding. By pressing left bumper, you can see a character's stats to get a feel for how best to stack your team. The two most important stats on the screen are spirit damage and melee damage. These will help inform you on how you should be attacking with each character to maximize your party's efficiency and killing power. If your character has a higher melee stat, you'll be wasting turns if you're spamming attacks that hinge on the spirit stat. Though, the tough thing here is that the game isn't exactly clear on which attacks rely on which stat. There's no indication during combat, so it's a bit of trial and error to get things right. If you press the right bumper, you'll be taken to the character's skills screen. This screen is where most of your big decisions outside of combat will take place. Each time a character levels up, they're given stat points you can allocate wherever you like, assuming you have enough points for the upgrade cost. As you can see, your character's upgrade paths are divided into 4 categories. Offense increases the amount of melee damage the character puts out. Spirit energy increases the damage of spirit-based attacks as well as the maximum spirit energy your character has. Movement increases the number of tiles your character can move on their turn. And lastly, power increases your maximum HP. Eventually you will max out everything, but the strange thing is that new attacks aren't tied to your character's level. You learn new techniques from putting points into your respective skills, and no, not just offense or spirit. Several attacks have techniques hidden in the movement and power paths, which I find a bit strange. I found that prioritizing your main stat is always a good idea for damage output, but don't neglect your power and movement stats. Your damage doesn't matter if you can't move around the board efficiently, and matters even less if you can't take a hit. Each character also gets an ultimate technique based on their main attack stat, like Yusuke gets an overcharged spirit gun, Hiei gets a dragon summon, and Kurama gets his death plant, and so on. I'll touch on the inventory momentarily since it ties into a bit of a problem with the game. Once you're actually in combat, you have a variety of things you can do. Kind of like D&D, you always have movement unless you're trapped or halted. You can move before or after you take an action, it's really up to you. When you select the move action, you'll be shown a set of green tiles, all of which designate a spot you can move to at that time. With the attack action, you'll be given access to all the techniques at your disposal, assuming you have the spirit energy to pull it off. Every attack has a set range, with some requiring distance between you and the enemy, and some requiring you to be right in the enemy's face. Alongside this, attacks can either hit a single target or a group. When you attack an enemy, you do bonus damage when attacking from the sides or from behind. You'll always be able to see what you're doing before you commit to the attack, and that's what makes positioning so important. Not to mention, if you end up deciding to reposition yourself, you can press the B button to go back to your original space. The only time this isn't possible is if you've already executed an attack or focus command after moving. Each action you take uses spirit energy and costs initiative. Initiative determines the turn order during combat, and the higher your initiative number, the lower down the turn order you fall. During any of your turns, you can press select to bring up the initiative order, but it doesn't scroll, so you can only see a handful of turns coming up. The turn order also doesn't designate specific numbers to monsters of the same name, so it's nearly impossible to differentiate between them and build a strategy around the turn order. This is only a problem when there's an absence of enemies with unique names and an abundance of enemies with the same generic name, which is basically always, so it's basically always a problem. Beneath that, you have your battle items. I'd honestly be surprised if anyone actually utilized this option because it's oddly cumbersome. The reason for this is that your inventory doesn't act the way you might assume, where every item you've collected is congregated into one place for every character to dig into as needed. Instead, you have to equip each character with items to take into battle, and they only have access to what you've given them. They can use those items on other characters, yeah, but you need to be close to the other person to do so. And once enemies start gaining access to their own AoEs, bunching up in a group isn't the best move. On top of that, each character has a limited number of item slots, starting off with just 1 and maxing out at 4. So sure, an emergency heal might be useful, but once you use that item, even if you have another one of the same name waiting in storage, you have to go in and manually assign that item each time. There aren't any item shops in the game either. The items you acquire come solely from a post-battle roulette system where you have to hope and pray you get items you'd even bother to use. The system isn't guaranteed to activate either, so you'll end up going for several battles without seeing a single item drop. Compounding on this issue is the lack of item descriptions once they're in your inventory. There are several different types and sizes of potions, but their names don't exactly lend themselves to being able to tell at a glance which is more potent, so you might end up accidentally taking a weaker heal into a big fight because you got the names mixed up. Added into the mix are one-time consumable items that sound like they should be accessories like the flame ring, but until you use it in battle, you won't know what it does. The game also doesn't tell you when your inventory is full, nor does it seem like there's any way to tell on your own. But once it is full, you completely lose the ability to pick up items. The game will still let you spin the roulette wheel for them and even award them to you, but they'll fall right into the Shadow Realm. So if you were waiting for big healing items and didn't know you were out of space, ripperoni my dude! Next up is your overdrive, which is the gray meter below your spirit energy. When that fills up, you can activate it in the menu and choose one of your attacks, which will kick out a powered up version of whatever you chose. The cool thing here is that if you use overdrive on the right attack, you'll get a very low resolution image representative of that attack's moment in the anime. Your overdrive does carry between battles, so there's another layer of strategy there, though don't be afraid to use it if you need to, since it doesn't take terribly long to fill back up. Focus has several actions tied to it that serve different but important functions. Defend is about as straightforward as you can get. It causes that character to guard until their turn comes back around, taking less damage in the meantime. Although, defending does cost a considerable amount of spirit energy for some reason, so you can't just spam it. Taunt forces every enemy in the immediate vicinity to focus on the character that activated it. Very helpful when you need to pull focus away from one of your party members on the edge of death. Mend is your way of healing if you have no items to fall back on. It costs even more spirit energy than Defend does and has a higher initiative cost too. You're gonna use this a lot, trust me. Lastly, there's Charge, which is your way of restoring spirit energy if there's no items to fall back on. It doesn't cost any spirit energy to use because that would be silly, but it does have a higher initiative cost than Defend does. You also have the option to just wait. If you don't feel like moving a character or like them where they are, waiting is a good way to end your turn early. Once you've decided what to do and end your turn, you have to choose what direction to orient your character since positioning does matter. From there, it's just a matter of watching the enemies take their turns before it cycles back to you. While the game only ends if your entire party gets wiped, that doesn't mean you can play recklessly. There is an actual penalty for a party member going down during a fight, and it can certainly bite you in the ass. The consequence is that you need to allow that character to rest for one match before taking them back into battle. If you don't, they'll start combat with half HP and spirit energy, making them susceptible to getting KO'd again. Something to keep in mind is that a downed party member also doesn't gain any experience. Just like the games before, Tournament Tactics does have its fair share of gimmicks, 2 of which have the highest likelihood of walling your progress. The others are mild inconveniences at most though. Here are a few so you can see what I mean. Timed battles, which are exactly what you think they are, though the timer is so high that you'd essentially have to be running in circles doing nothing to fail. Destination battles are battles in which your goal is to get one of your characters to stand on a very specific tile, usually somewhere on the other side of the map before time runs out. Then you have chase sequences. This is one of the 2 that has the potential to frustrate you. The goal here is to kill a very specific creature before it can make its way to the exit tile. Because this monster doesn't go out of its way to attack, it always has a low initiative number, so it gets to move about every other turn. If your movement stat is low for your party, you'll almost never catch up, especially with other creatures on the board still being aggressive. Finally, there are floodgates. Floodgates are the worst gimmick fight in this game, bar none. Floodgates are structures on the map that you need to destroy as soon as you can, while still contending with the monsters gunning for you. These structures are in the initiative order, and when their turn comes up, they spawn 2 more monsters. Typically, there are 2 of these gates present during one of these battles, and it's easy to suddenly find yourself walled in and overwhelmed by relatively beefy creatures. A worse iteration of this exists too, where the only way to stop the floodgates from activating is to send one of your party members to stand on a specific tile for a set amount of time. Until they're destroyed by running the timer out, they're impervious to all damage. And if the character that you sent over to stand on that tile moves or gets killed, the timer resets. This particular iteration of the floodgate event caused me to level grind because I just didn't have the movement or attack power to get to my destination. Which reminds me, let's talk about the maps for a second. The maps in this game can be relatively frustrating through both their design as well as where the game decides to place your party members at the beginning of each stage. Usually they're all bunched together, and since your characters can't pass through each other in any reliable way, you're forced to make those in the back wait while you move the front row out of the way. This is especially annoying when you have to pass through areas that are only 1 tile wide. You just have to form a conga line and hope you don't get bombarded by AoEs in the meantime. There are also some maps with increased elevation, and traversing these tiers eats up your movement fast. At first, these map traits are novel, but as the game goes on, more and more maps place you in situations where you're all squeezed together with neutered movement or having to move single file. The only saving grace here is that you can still hit enemies with ranged attacks across the gaps in the map, but that goes both ways and they can do the same to you. Overall, the game itself does ramp up in difficulty, but it's not untenable. As you go along, you gain access to more and more party members who you will or won't gravitate to depending on both your needs and your playstyle. By the time you make it to the Dark Tournament Finals, you should have your main squad leveled up enough to nuke down the members of Team Toguro with your strongest overdrive attacks. Yusuke's battle, though, comes down to a one-on-one, so maybe make sure he's got his overdrive ready when you head into the final stage. There is also post-game content that you literally cannot access unless every single party member is at max level. Even the characters you'll never use like Yukina and Rinku. The game will not grant you access otherwise, and you won't hit max level through the story mode, so guess what? It's grind time! So what's the challenge that awaits? You square off with the revived versions of the Beasts of May's castle. And honestly, it's a joke. By forcing you to max out and not locking you into specific party formations, every single one of these fights is a cakewalk. Hiei alone with his dragon summon can basically one-shot most high HP enemies. It's a total waste of your time and you should completely ignore it. Here are just a few more random tidbits about the game before we wrap up. It's not worth it to invest too heavily in Genkai because the game permanently removes her from your party after Toguro kills her. You only get her back for the post-game. Yukina does have healing capabilities, so if you want a white mage, that's sort of an option. Aside from base experience from completing a battle, characters will gain bonus experience based on the enemies they themselves destroyed. Chu ends up being the best tank and melee fighter. Use him for taunt tactics. You can't play as Yoko, and the only time Yoko shows up is during the animation for Kurama's Death Plant attack. As long as you're on the world map in some form, you can save at any time by pressing the start button. If you do decide to grind for max level to get into the post-game, this is the easiest stage to do it on. Max out Hiei's movement, put him at the head of the party that you need to level, and just rush to the goal. Don't attack or move with anyone. Just run to the door over and over. You can get there in 2 turns with maxed movement. So yeah, Tournament Tactics is a pretty neat game with easy to pick up mechanics. Of all the games we've talked about today, this is the only one I can actually recommend. It won't blow you away or anything, but it's serviceable. You might have a good time, especially if you like tactics games. I give it 7.5 Botons out of 10.
And those are the games I played. It was a mixed bag of good, bad, and ugly, but it was an interesting journey nonetheless. I played all of these games over on my Twitch, and I plan to play more anime games in the future so I can talk about them here, so pop in sometime and say hello. Who knows, maybe you can end up seeing one of your own chats in the next video. On screen, you'll notice several patrons have a character portrait associated with them from anime or gaming. This is to add a bit of flair for patrons, and they'll always see themselves in the shoutout. Want to see your name in the credits of every video and now potentially have one of your favorite characters to represent you? Head on over to the Somewhere Past Never Patreon page, and we can make that happen. At any rate, remember to take care of yourselves and others. I hope your days remain or become Saturnian, and as always, thanks for watching.